Hey guys, welcome back. If this is your first time here, settle in. This is the place for slow, quiet history, the kind that asks nothing of you except to close your eyes and listen. Before we start, if you're enjoying these long, slow histories, a like helps more than you'd think, and if you want to, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always like picturing that, all these different rooms, all these different time zones, all quiet at once. Now, go ahead. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Let your shoulders drop from your ears. Pull the blanket up. You don't need to remember any of this. You just need to let it wash over you. Tonight we're going somewhere cold. And small, and very old. A village. No name you'd recognize. Somewhere in Europe, sometime between the 12th and 17th centuries, though the exact year hardly matters, because for the people who lived it, time moved differently. Seasons mattered more than dates. Harvests mattered more than calendars. Picture mud streets, narrow and rutted from cart wheels. Thatched roofs holding in smoke from low fires. No electric light anywhere, not for another 600 years. Just candle flame and moonlight, and the deep, total darkness that used to exist before anyone knew how to push it back. In a world like that, darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a presence of its own. Something that lived in the spaces between houses, in the tree line past the last field, in the well after the sun went down. And into that darkness, people poured their fears, their unexplained illnesses, their dead livestock, their sick children, their bad luck. And somewhere in that same darkness, quietly, dangerously, stood women. Ordinary women, mostly. Herbalists. Midwives. Widows living alone at the edge of town. Women who knew things other people didn't, or who simply lived differently than expected. Tonight, we're going to walk through what really happened to those women. Not the version with pointed hats and broomsticks, the real one. The one built from fear, from gossip, from desperate people looking for someone to blame when the world felt cruel and unexplainable. We'll walk through the fear that shaped an entire era. We'll meet the people most likely to be accused, and understand why. We'll sit with healers whose knowledge made them indispensable in daylight, and suspicious after dark. We'll follow rumors as they traveled from one kitchen table to the next, gathering weight with every retelling. It's not a comfortable story, not entirely. But it's a human one, and it moves slowly, the way real history does. No jump scares here. No sudden reveals. Just candlelight, and low voices, and centuries settling like dust, so let your eyes rest. Let your breathing slow. You don't have to hold on to any of the names or dates. Just let the village take shape around you, the smoke, the mud, the flickering windows, and somewhere out past the last house, past the edge of the firelight, someone is walking home alone in the dark, unaware that tomorrow a neighbor's cow will fall sick, and everything in her quiet life will begin, very slowly, to change. The fire has burned low in most houses now. Picture the village settling for the night, one small sound at a time. A door bolted shut with a wooden bar. A dog turning 3 times before it lies down against the hearth. Somewhere, a baby's cry rises and falls and finally goes quiet. There is no street lighting. There will not be, not for centuries. Once the sun drops behind the tree line, the village doesn't dim gradually, it simply ends. One moment there is a lane, houses, a well, a church spire. The next, there is only shape and shadow, guessed at more than seen. Inside the houses, life continues in miniature. A woman banks the coals so they'll hold through until morning, arranging them with a practiced hand so no spark escapes onto the straw-covered floor. A man checks the latch on the animal pen twice, because a fox took 2 hens last month and he hasn't forgiven himself for it. Children are tucked close to the fire, the warmest place in a home that has no other heat. Outside, the world belongs to different things. Foxes move along the hedgerows. Owls call from the church tower, a sound villagers know well enough not to fear, though newcomers sometimes do. Wind moves through bare branches with a particular kind of hollow sound that, centuries later, historians would find described again and again in old journals and court records, the wind that sounds like breathing, the wind that sounds like someone standing just behind you. It's worth pausing here. In this ordinary darkness, because this is the stage on which everything else in our story will unfold. Understand this darkness, and you understand the people who lived inside it. There was no way to verify anything at night. No way to see clearly past your own doorstep. If a shape moved along the tree line, you couldn't check whether it was a neighbor, a deer, or nothing at all. You simply had to decide, in the space of a heartbeat, what you believed you saw, and so belief did a great deal of work that light would normally do for us. Belief filled in the edges of every shadow. Belief decided whether a sound was a cat knocking over a pail, or something else entirely. Most nights, nothing happened. Most nights were simply this: banked fires, sleeping children, a dog steady breathing, the long quiet hours until dawn. But every so often, something did happen. A cow went dry overnight for no clear reason. A child ran a fever that wouldn't break. A husband came home from the fields talking about a strange light he'd seen moving low across the far pasture, and when those nights came, the villagers didn't reach for explanations we might reach for now. They reached for the only framework they had, one built from scripture, folklore, and centuries of half-remembered stories passed down through grandmothers. Somewhere, in one of those low, dark houses, a woman lay awake a little longer than usual, listening to the wind move through the hedgerow outside her window, unaware that come morning, the shape of her ordinary life was about to shift. Morning came slowly to villages like this, grey light easing in before the sun ever cleared the tree line, but the fear that had gathered in the dark didn't dissolve with the daylight. It simply changed shape, it wearing a rounder, more presentable frame, one that could be discussed over a well, or during a shared meal, or in the doorway between two households. To understand what came next in our story, it helps to sit for a moment inside the medieval mind, not to judge it, but to understand it on its own terms. Life, for most people in this period, was profoundly uncertain. A healthy child could die within days of an unnamed fever. A field that promised a good harvest could be flattened overnight by hail. A cow, fine one evening, could be dead by morning, its milk having simply stopped, for no visible reason at all. Today, we have language for these things. Bacteria, weather systems, nutritional deficiency. But in a world without microscopes, without meteorology, without any framework for cause and effect beyond what could be seen and touched, these events had no obvious explanation, and an unexplained bad thing is, for most people, far more frightening than an explained one. The mind doesn't rest easily with a mystery. It searches, almost compulsively, for a reason, any reason. Religion offered one kind of answer. Sermon spoke of sin, of divine punishment, of a world locked in constant struggle between good and evil. But religion alone didn't quite satisfy the need for something closer to hand, something local, something that could be pointed to, confronted, understood. So alongside official religious explanation, an older, quieter belief system persisted, a folk understanding of the world where certain people, through gift, choice, or curse, held power over ordinary events. Where illness could be sent. Where luck could be stolen. Where the natural and the supernatural blurred into a single continuous fabric, this wasn't ignorance, not exactly. It was a coherent, internally consistent way of making sense of a world that offered very little certainty otherwise, and within that worldview, certain kinds of people became natural focal points for fear. Not randomly chosen. Not simply unlucky. There was a pattern to who came under suspicion, one shaped by economics, by social position, by how well or poorly a woman fit into the expectations of her community. We'll spend the rest of tonight's story following that pattern, watching how ordinary suspicion, born from ordinary fear, slowly hardened into something with the power to end a life. For now, simply notice this: in a world without answers, someone always becomes the answer. Not because they did anything, but because fear, left alone in the dark too long, needs somewhere to go. If fear needed somewhere to go, it rarely traveled far. Historians who've spent careers studying witch trial records across England, Scotland, Germany, and France have noticed something remarkably consistent. The accused weren't chosen at random. They tended to share a set of quiet, overlapping traits, ones that, taken together, made a woman more visible, more vulnerable, and more available to suspicion than her neighbors. Age was one factor. Older women, particularly widows past the point of bearing children, appear again and again in the historical record. A woman without a husband to vouch for her, without children still at home to soften her image, occupied an unusual social position. Independent, in a world that didn't quite know what to do with independent women, poverty was another. A woman who had to beg, who came to a neighbor's door asking for bread, or milk, or a small loan, put that neighbor in an uncomfortable position. If the neighbor refused, and something went wrong afterward, a sick child, a dead cow, guilt curdled easily into suspicion. Surely the refused woman had cursed them in retaliation. It was, in a strange way, easier to believe in a curse than to sit with the discomfort of having turned away someone in need. Sharp tongues mattered too. A woman known for arguing, for cursing under her breath, for muttering when crossed, carried a kind of reputation that made her an easy fit for accusation later. Villagers remembered those muttered words. They gathered them, quietly, over years, long before any formal charge was ever made, and then there was simple isolation. A woman living alone at the edge of a village, without close family nearby, without a network of people willing to defend her character, was, in the coldest sense, an easier target than a well-connected wife with brothers and sons to speak for her. None of this means every accused woman fit every category. Men were accused too, though far less often. Occasionally a wealthy or well-connected woman found herself named. History rarely moves in perfectly straight lines, but the pattern holds often enough to tell us something important. Witchcraft accusations weren't primarily about supernatural belief. They were, underneath everything, a mirror held up to a community's deepest anxieties about who belonged and who didn't. About which women fit comfortably into expected roles, and which ones, through no particular fault of their own, stood slightly outside them. Picture, for a moment, an old woman living alone near the edge of a village like the one we walked through earlier. She keeps to herself. She grows herbs along her fence line, more out of necessity than mystery. She has outlived a husband, and perhaps a child or two, and speaks to almost no one most days. She isn't dangerous. She isn't gifted with any power beyond ordinary human resilience, but she is visible, in a way that makes her easy to imagine, easy to whisper about, easy, eventually, to blame, and blame, once it starts moving through a village, rarely stays still for long. Among all the women who found themselves under suspicion, none occupied a stranger position than the healer. Every village, no matter how small, needed someone who understood the body. Someone who knew which plant eased a fever, which poultice drew infection from a wound, which tea calmed a stomach turned by bad water or spoiled meat. Long before hospitals, before trained physicians reached rural communities, this knowledge lived in the hands and memory of local women, passed down mother to daughter, generation to generation. Picture her kitchen for a moment. Bundles of dried herbs hanging from low beams, yarrow, chamomile, feverfew, tied with plain string, turning slowly in whatever draught moves through the room. Jars of oils along a windowsill. A mortar and pestle worn smooth from years of grinding roots and seeds into paste. She knows things by feel as much as by memory. The particular bitterness of willow bark, useful for pain. The careful, exact dose of certain plants that heal in small amounts and harm in large ones. This last part matters more than it might first seem, because many of the plants a medieval healer relied on were, in truth, genuinely dangerous if measured wrong. Foxglove could steady a weak heart, or stop one entirely, depending on the hand that prepared it. Certain roots eased pain in one dose and caused violent illness in another. A healer's skill lived almost entirely in her judgment. In knowing exactly where the line between remedy and poison Saturday, this made her indispensable. It also made her, quietly, dangerous in the eyes of anyone inclined to be suspicious. Consider the position she occupied. When her remedies worked, and most of the time they did, she was thanked, perhaps paid in eggs or grain, and quietly relied upon again. But when they failed, when a fever didn't break, when a difficult birth ended badly, when a child she'd treated died anyway, of causes utterly beyond her control, the very knowledge that made her useful now made her suspect. How, after all, could an ordinary woman possess such intimate understanding of what heals and what harms, unless her knowledge came from somewhere else? Somewhere darker. This wasn't a fair question, but it followed a certain grim logic. A skill impressive enough to save a life was, in the same breath, impressive enough to end one. And in a world already primed to look for hidden causes behind unexplained outcomes, that kind of power invited exactly the wrong kind of attention. Church authorities, over time, grew increasingly uneasy with folk healing more broadly, not because it didn't work, but because it operated outside their control, drawing on knowledge and tradition that predated, and sometimes quietly ignored, official religious teaching. So the herbalist lived a strange, double life. Trusted in daylight, at the first sign of illness. Watched carefully after dark, when things went wrong instead of right. She rarely knew, on any given evening, which version of herself her neighbors currently believed in. If the herbalist lived a double life, the midwife lived one even more precarious. She was, in most villages, the only person present at the exact moment a new life entered the world, and often, the only person present when one didn't survive the attempt. Picture the scene, late at night, a small upstairs room lit by a single candle, its flame bending with every draught from the shuttered window. The midwife kneels beside a straw mattress, her sleeves pushed back, her voice low and steady, the way it needs to be when everyone else in the room is frightened. She has done this dozens of times. hundreds, perhaps, over a long career. She knows the sounds a labor makes when it's progressing well, and the different, more troubling sounds it makes when something has gone wrong. She knows how to turn a child position badly. She knows which herbs ease the worst of the pain, and which ones, in careful hands, can hasten a labor that has stalled too long. Most nights end well. A cry fills the room, thin and furious, and relief spreads through the house like warmth from a reopened fire, but not every night ends that way. Medieval childbirth, for all a midwife's skill, remained genuinely dangerous, shadowed by infection, by complications no amount of herb or prayer could resolve, by the simple, brutal unpredictability of the body. When a birth went wrong, when a mother or child didn't survive, grief needed somewhere to settle. And the midwife, the one person who had been closest to the moment everything changed, often became that resting place. It rarely happened immediately. Grief, in its first days, usually stayed grief. But over weeks, months, sometimes years, as a family replayed the worst night of their lives, questions crept in. Had the midwife done everything right? Had she moved quickly enough? Had she perhaps, in some way no one could quite articulate, wanted the outcome she'd witnessed? This suspicion carried a particular cruelty, because it targeted the very knowledge that made a midwife valuable in the first place. Her intimate understanding of the body, of pain, of the strange border between life and death that childbirth walked along, became, in the retelling, evidence of something other than skill. Church attitudes complicated things further. Some clergy viewed midwifery with quiet unease, uncomfortable with a role that placed a woman in such intimate command over the beginning of life, a moment theology insisted belonged, ultimately, to God alone, and so the midwife walked a narrow path her entire working life. Welcomed urgently in the middle of the night, when labor began without warning. Regarded, in daylight, with a caution she could feel but rarely named aloud, she rarely spoke of this tension. There wasn't much use in speaking of it. She simply continued, kneeling beside mattress after mattress, catching child after child, carrying quietly the knowledge that gratitude and suspicion, in her line of work, often lived in the very same house. Somewhere across the village, another woman was hearing whispers about a different kind of danger entirely, whispers that had nothing to do with childbirth, and everything to do with what people believed happened after the candles were blown out. Suspicion, on its own, rarely accomplishes much. It needs a vehicle. In a medieval village, that vehicle was almost always the same: conversation, passed low and quiet, from one doorway to the next. Picture the well at the center of the village, worn smooth stone circling a dark drop into cold water. Women gathered here daily, buckets in hand, waiting their turn, and it was here, more than almost anywhere else, that a village's real business got conducted, not the business of the church or the manor house, but the quieter, more consequential business of who was trusted and who wasn't. A conversation at the well might begin innocently enough. One woman mentioning that her hens hadn't laid well this week. Another remembering that she'd passed old Margaret's cottage just yesterday, and Margaret had looked at her strangely, hadn't she, standing there in her doorway with that look on her face. Neither woman intended harm, not really. This was simply how information moved, how a small community made sense of its own daily rhythms. But gossip has a particular property worth noticing. Each time a story gets retold, it sharpens slightly. Details that were uncertain in the first telling become certain by the fifth. A strange look becomes a clear glare. A passing comment becomes something closer to a threat, By the time a piece of gossip had traveled through a dozen households, it often bore only a loose resemblance to whatever small, ordinary moment had started it. This mattered enormously, because formal accusations of witchcraft, when they eventually came, rarely emerged from nowhere. They grew out of exactly this kind of accumulated, informal testimony, years of small comments, half-remembered glances, and vague unease, gathered slowly like sediment at the bottom of a still pond. Court records from the period reflect this pattern clearly. Witnesses testifying against an accused woman frequently cited events from years, even decades, earlier. A soured relationship from childhood. A dispute over a boundary line, long since resolved on paper but apparently never forgotten in memory. An argument at a market stall that everyone else had moved past, except, it seemed, for the person still quietly nursing it. Gossip also served another function, one rarely acknowledged at the time. It let a community manage its anxieties without confronting them directly. Rather than sitting with the uncomfortable truth that illness struck randomly, that some harvests simply failed, that death visited the young as readily as the old, a village could instead focus its unease on a specific, nameable person. Someone to watch. Someone to discuss. Someone, eventually, to blame. There was no single moment when talk became danger. It simply accumulated, the way frost accumulates on a window overnight, invisible while it's happening, and then, quite suddenly, impossible to see past. Somewhere in the village that night, a woman washing her bucket at the well overheard her own name mentioned 2 doorways down, spoken too quietly for her to make out the words, and felt, without quite knowing why, a small, cold unease settle into her chest. To understand the accusations that followed, we have to sit, briefly, inside the imagination of the period, not to validate it, but to understand the shape fear had taken. By this point in our story, villagers didn't believe witches simply existed in some vague, general sense. They held remarkably specific, detailed beliefs about what supposedly happened once darkness fell and ordinary households settled to sleep. Many believed witches gathered, occasionally, in remote places, a crossroads, a clearing beyond the last cultivated field, sometimes an old standing stone left over from a much older, half-forgotten era. These gatherings, later called Sabbaths by church authorities, were imagined as inversions of ordinary community life. Where a village feast involved shared bread and quiet fellowship, these imagined gatherings involved feasting on things no decent person would touch. Where church services moved toward God, these gatherings moved, deliberately, away from Him. It's worth noting clearly, here, that no reliable evidence has ever shown such gatherings actually occurred in any organized way. What we're describing is belief, not history, a shared cultural imagination, shaped heavily by church teaching, folklore, and, eventually, forced confession. Villagers also believed in more intimate, domestic forms of witchcraft. A woman might slip into a neighbor's home unseen, they believed, and interfere with butter that refused to churn, or milk that soured overnight, or bread that failed, inexplicably, to rise. Livestock that sickened without visible cause were frequently attributed to a curse cast by someone nearby, someone with a grudge, real or imagined. Familiars formed another key part of this imagined world, the belief that a witch kept a small animal companion, a cat, a toad, occasionally a bird, through which she supposedly worked her will. A stray cat lingering too long near a suspected woman's cottage could, in this framework, become evidence rather than coincidence. None of this was based on observation in any meaningful sense. It was based on centuries of accumulated folklore, filtered through religious anxiety, and reinforced by the simple human tendency to notice and remember whatever confirms what we already suspect. What makes this period particularly difficult to look back on clearly is how sincerely these beliefs were held. This wasn't cynical persecution, most of the time, carried out by people who knew better. Judges, neighbors, even accused women themselves, often shared the same basic framework of belief. They disagreed only about who, specifically, the framework applied to. This sincerity, oddly, made the danger worse rather than better. A cynical accuser can sometimes be reasoned with, shown the gap between claim and evidence. A sincere believer, convinced they're protecting their community from genuine, supernatural harm, rarely responds the same way to reason, and so belief, however mistaken, moved through these villages with the full weight of conviction behind it, quiet, persistent, and, for the women eventually caught within it, entirely inescapable. Not everything believed about witchcraft during this period was pure fear and imagination. Underneath the darker suspicions ran an older, gentler tradition, one most villagers practiced themselves without ever considering it dangerous. Picture a young mother tucking a small cloth charm beneath her infant's cradle, a bundle of dried herbs tied with red thread, meant to ward off illness and bad luck. Picture a farmer pausing at the edge of his field before planting, murmuring a half-remembered rhyme passed down from his grandfather, more habit by now than belief, though he'd never admit to skipping it. This was folk magic in its most ordinary form, small, protective rituals woven into the fabric of daily life. Practiced by nearly everyone, rich and poor, devout and casual alike. A horseshoe nailed above a doorway. Salt scattered along a threshold. Certain words spoken quietly over a wound, alongside whatever herbal remedy was actually doing the medical work. Villagers rarely saw a contradiction between this quiet, everyday magic and their sincere Christian faith. The two coexisted comfortably for most people, led together rather than opposed, a folk tradition running alongside official religion the way a footpath runs alongside a main road, unofficial, but well-worn. The trouble arose not from the practice of folk magic itself, but from who was believed to practice it, and toward what end. A charm meant to protect a household was, in the eyes of most villagers, entirely different from a curse meant to harm one. But the line between these two, in practice, could blur easily, especially when viewed through the lens of suspicion rather than trust. The same herbs a healer used to cure could, villagers believed, be reversed and used to harm. The same word spoken to protect could, spoken differently, or by different hands, supposedly curse instead. Intent, invisible and unprovable, became the deciding factor in whether an action counted as harmless tradition or dangerous witchcraft. An intent, of course, is exactly the kind of thing a frightened, grieving community tends to assume rather than investigate. This ambiguity worked, again and again, against women already under suspicion for other reasons. A charm that would have gone unnoticed if performed by a well-liked, well-connected wife could become, in the hands of an isolated widow already whispered about at the well. Damning evidence of far darker intent, church authorities, over time, grew increasingly uncomfortable with folk magic broadly, regardless of its stated purpose, viewing it as a rival to, rather than a companion of, official religious practice. What villagers had long treated as harmless customs slowly became, in official eyes, something closer to heresy, and so an old woman tying dried herbs above her own door, exactly as her mother had taught her, exactly as half her neighbors still did without a second thought, could find that same simple gesture used against her, years later, as proof of something she never intended, and never truly practiced at all. By this point in our story, a pattern should be emerging, quiet but unmistakable: healing and harming, protection and curse, folk tradition and forbidden practice. These pairs sat far closer together than most villagers like to admit. And nowhere did that closeness matter more than in the eyes of the Church, whose evolving position on these matters would eventually reshape the entire landscape we've been walking through tonight. For centuries earlier, Church authorities had treated most folk practices with something close to indifference, occasionally mild disapproval, rarely genuine alarm. Village charms and remedies were seen, largely, as harmless superstition, unsophisticated but not particularly dangerous. The kind of thing that might fade naturally as formal religious education spread more widely through rural communities. That position shifted, gradually and then more sharply, as theological thinking evolved. A growing body of religious scholars began arguing that folk magic wasn't simply misguided tradition, but something with genuine spiritual danger attached, a doorway, potentially, through which darker forces could enter a community. This shift mattered enormously, because it transformed the entire framework surrounding our story. What had once been dismissed as harmless village custom now carried the possibility of formal religious concern. A healer's remedy, a midwife's charm. An old woman's protective herbs above her door, all of it now existed under a slightly different, more dangerous kind of scrutiny than it had a generation earlier. Picture a village priest, standing at his pulpit on a quiet Sunday morning, delivering a sermon that would have sounded unfamiliar to his own predecessor decades before. Warning, not simply against sin in the ordinary sense, but against a specific, named danger living somewhere among his own parishioners. Watch, carefully, the faces in his congregation as he speaks, some nodding solemnly, genuinely moved by concern for their community's spiritual safety. Others glancing, almost involuntarily, toward a particular pew, a particular neighbor, already turning private suspicion into something closer to conviction. This is how theological shift and village gossip, two very different forces, began working together toward the same outcome. Official religious concern gave village suspicion a language, a framework, a legitimacy it hadn't fully possessed before. And village suspicion, in turn, gave official concern specific names, specific faces, specific women already primed, by years of quiet whisper, to be exactly the kind of danger the Church now warned against. Neither force alone would likely have produced what followed. Village gossip without institutional backing tends to fade, eventually, replaced by newer concerns. Institutional concern without local suspicion has no particular target to settle on, but together, gossip and doctrine, whisper and sermon, reinforced each other in a way that neither could have managed alone. Tightening slowly around specific women in specific villages, women who had, in most cases, done nothing more than heal, or deliver children, or tie dried herbs above their own doors, exactly as their mothers had taught them. What began as a slow theological shift was about to become something far more immediate, far more procedural. Somewhere, in a room we haven't yet visited, someone was preparing to make the first formal accusation. The room we hadn't yet visited turns out, in most cases, to have been small and unremarkable, a study, perhaps, in a monastery or bishop's residence, lit by a single lamp, shelves lined with manuscripts copied slowly, by hand, over years. It was in rooms like this, more than in any village, that the machinery eventually turned against women like the ones we've been following tonight. By the 15th century, a shift had been building for some time within certain corners of the Church. 1. That moved witchcraft from the category of foolish superstition into something far more alarming, a genuine, organized threat to Christian society, deserving serious theological and legal attention. Picture a scholar bent over a wooden desk, candle burned low, carefully compiling reports, testimonies, and theological arguments into a single unified text. This is, in essence, how some of the period's most consequential documents came into being. Works cataloguing supposed witch behavior, describing how to identify a witch, how to interrogate one, how to secure confession. Written with the sincere conviction of men who believed they were protecting the innocent from genuine spiritual danger, these texts spread slowly at first, copied by hand, passed between monasteries and universities. Then, as printing technology developed and spread across Europe, they spread considerably faster, reaching magistrates, local clergy, and eventually ordinary literate townspeople in a way earlier folklore never could. This mattered enormously for our story. What had previously existed as scattered, informal village suspicion now had something it lacked before: a shared vocabulary, a standardized set of signs and symptoms, a common framework that a magistrate in one region could apply just as readily as a magistrate 300 miles away, a birthmark in an unusual place, an unnatural spot on the skin that didn't respond to a pinprick the way ordinary flesh should, an animal seen too often near a particular cottage. None of this was new, exactly, as folk believe, but codified, written down, distributed, it took on a weight and authority it had never carried when it simply passed, unwritten, from one grandmother's memory to another's. It's worth pausing to notice something quietly tragic in this transition. The women we've spent this evening following, herbalists, midwives, isolated widows, hadn't changed at all. Their daily lives continued much as they always had, tending gardens, delivering children, murmuring old remedies passed down through generations. What changed was the framework surrounding them, the lens through which their ordinary behavior would now be examined. Historians studying this period often describe it as a slow tightening rather than a sudden event, and that description fits what we've traced tonight rather well. Fear, gossip, theological anxiety, and now, formal codification, each layer settling atop the last, until an entire structure existed, ready and waiting, for the moment an actual accusation would finally be spoken aloud in a real village, against a real, specific woman. That moment, in villages across the continent, was now drawing steadily closer. Every formal accusation, however large the trial that eventually followed, began small. Picture an ordinary afternoon in a modest farmhouse. A cow, healthy the evening before, is found lying still in its stall, unable to rise, milk gone entirely dry. The farmer crouches beside the animal, running a hand along its flank, searching for some visible sign of illness or injury, and finding nothing at all. This absence of explanation is, in many ways, the true beginning of our story's darkest turn. A visible cause, a wound, a known sickness spreading through the herd, would have settled the matter quickly, sadly but simply. But an unexplained collapse left a gap, and gaps, in a mind already primed by years of gossip and sermon. Rarely stayed empty long. The farmer's wife, standing in the doorway, might recall, almost involuntarily, a moment from the week before. A neighbor, an elderly widow living alone at the village edge, had come asking to borrow a measure of grain, and had been refused, the family having little enough to spare themselves. The widow had said nothing unusual in response. Perhaps only a quiet, resigned nod, and a slow walk back toward her own cottage, but now, standing over a dying cow, that ordinary refusal took on a different shape entirely. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reveals something essential about how accusations actually formed, in practice, far more often than official records tend to show. They rarely began with some elaborate confrontation or dramatic accusation shouted across a village square. They began quietly, almost privately, in a single household's private reasoning, a connection drawn between two unrelated events by a mind searching, understandably, for some explanation to hold on to. From there, the suspicion would typically move outward, slowly. Perhaps mentioned first to a close neighbor, framed carefully, almost apologetically, not an accusation exactly, just an observation, a coincidence worth noting. That neighbor might recall something of their own, some small unexplained trouble from months before, and suddenly two households shared a single, growing thread of concern. Weeks might pass this way, sometimes months, suspicion circulating quietly through private conversation long before it ever reached anyone with formal authority. Villagers rarely rushed toward accusation, whatever popular imagination might suggest. Most people understood, even without articulating it clearly, the gravity of what a formal accusation could set in motion, but eventually, in enough cases across enough villages, private suspicion crossed a threshold into something more formal. A conversation with the local priest. A complaint brought before a magistrate. And once that threshold was crossed, the entire machinery we traced in our last chapter, the codified texts, the established procedures, the accumulated theological weight, stood ready, waiting, to take hold of what had begun as nothing more than a dead cow and an old woman's quiet, resigned nod. Once a formal accusation reached a magistrate, the process that followed bore only a loose resemblance to what we might recognize today as a fair trial. Picture a modest courtroom, little more than a large room in a town hall or manor house, wooden benches arranged before a raised table where a magistrate, sometimes accompanied by clergy, would preside over proceedings that carried devastating weight for the woman standing, or often kneeling, before them. The rules of evidence, as we understand them now, simply didn't apply in the way we'd expect. Spectral evidence, testimony describing dreams, visions, or supposed encounters with a person's spirit rather than their physical presence, was frequently admitted as legitimate proof. A witness might testify, sincerely, that the accused had appeared to them in a dream, tormenting them in some way, and this testimony, however unverifiable, could carry real weight in determining guilt. Physical examination formed another disturbing pillar of these proceedings. Investigators searched the accused's body for what were called witches' marks, unusual moles, scars, or blemishes believed to serve as places where a familiar might feed. Given that nearly every human body carries some variation of mole or mark, this practice guaranteed that evidence, of a sort, could always be found, regardless of what it actually represented. Perhaps most troubling of all was the swimming test. Used in some regions though not universally, where an accused woman would be bound and lowered into water, the reasoning holding that water, as a pure element, would reject a witch, causing her to float, while an innocent woman would sink. Notice the impossible position this created. Survival itself became a form of evidence against her. Legal representation, in any form we'd recognize today, was essentially absent. The accused typically stood alone, without counsel, often without even a clear understanding of the specific charges leveled against her, expected to answer questions designed less to uncover truth than to extract confession, and confession, once obtained, functioned as the single most powerful piece of evidence a court could possess, regardless of how that confession had actually been secured. We'll spend more time with this troubling reality shortly, but it's worth noting here, clearly, that the presence of a confession in trial records tells us far less about actual guilt than about the methods used to obtain it. It would be a mistake to imagine every magistrate in every trial as a cruel or cynical figure. Many, perhaps most, sincerely believed they were fulfilling a serious moral duty, protecting their community from genuine spiritual danger. This sincerity, again, made the process more dangerous rather than less, because it meant procedural safeguards, the kind built specifically to protect the innocent, held little weight against a conviction already held before the trial had even properly begun. For the woman standing before that raised table, guilt had, in a very real sense, already been decided somewhere upstream, in gossip, in sermon, in accumulated years of quiet suspicion. The trial itself was, too often, simply the formal echo of a verdict reached long before. If we trace back through every stage of our story tonight, from the first whisper at the well to the final moment before a magistrate's table, a single thread runs through nearly all of it: quiet but unmistakable isolation. The women most likely to find themselves standing before that raised table shared, again and again, a common absence, an absence of protection, of advocates, of people willing and able to stand publicly on their behalf when suspicion finally hardened into formal accusation. Picture two women, side by side, in the same imagined village. One is a respected wife, mother to several grown sons, married into a well-regarded local family, her days filled with the same domestic work as any other woman of her standing. Herbs and remedies included among her ordinary skills. The other is a widow, childless or with children long since moved away, living alone at the village edge, her only regular company the occasional customer seeking a remedy or charm. Should identical gossip somehow attach itself to both women, their likely outcomes diverge sharply. The first woman has brothers, sons, a husband's extended family, all with reputations and social standing invested in defending her. Any formal accusation risks becoming, immediately, a conflict with an entire connected family, a cost most accusers, and even most magistrates, hesitated to invite. The second woman has no equivalent shield. An accusation against her costs an accuser almost nothing socially. No powerful family rises to contest it. No husband's reputation stands to be damaged alongside her own. She is, in the coldest possible sense, simply easier to accuse. This pattern appears with striking consistency across surviving trial records from this period, historians noting again and again how disproportionately accusations fell upon widows, unmarried older women, and those living at the physical and social margins of their communities. Poverty compounded this vulnerability further. A woman with no land, no inheritance, no family wealth to draw upon, often had no means to travel elsewhere should suspicion grow too heavy in her home village, no resources to seek any kind of formal legal counsel. However limited such counsel might have been in this period, regardless, it's worth sitting quietly with what this pattern actually reveals. Accusations of witchcraft, for all their supernatural language, functioned in practice as a remarkably efficient mechanism for identifying and removing a community's most vulnerable members, precisely those least able to resist or recover from the accusation once made. This wasn't calculated cruelty in most individual cases. It was something perhaps more unsettling, an unconscious social pattern, invisible to the people living inside it, quietly channeling fear and grief toward those with the least power to push back against it. Somewhere in a village not unlike the one we've walked through tonight, an isolated woman sat alone by her fire, unaware that her very aloneness, the quiet, ordinary fact of having no one beside her, had already marked her as a likely target long before any specific accusation was ever spoken. We arrive now at the part of our story that's hardest to sit with, though we'll move through it slowly, gently, the way we have with everything else tonight. Confession, as we noted earlier, carried enormous weight in these proceedings. A woman who confessed to witchcraft essentially sealed her own conviction, regardless of what actual evidence, however flawed, had been gathered against her. This created a powerful, troubling incentive within the system itself. Obtaining confession became, for many magistrates and interrogators, the primary goal of the entire process. Methods used to obtain confession varied considerably by region and period, and ranged from prolonged questioning and sleep deprivation to more severe physical measures. Applied under the belief that a witch's supposed pact with darker forces made her resistant to ordinary means of persuasion, we won't dwell on the specific mechanics of what was done. What matters more, for our purposes tonight, is understanding what such methods actually produced, and what they reveal about the reliability of the confessions that followed. Confession obtained through prolonged suffering tells us remarkably little about actual guilt, and remarkably much about human endurance. Historians who've studied surviving trial records have noted, again and again, a troubling pattern. Confessions extracted under these conditions frequently included exactly the details interrogators expected, or had, in some cases, already suggested through the framing of their questions. A woman under severe duress, desperate for the suffering to end, often found herself, consciously or not, providing answers shaped by what she sensed her questioner wanted to hear, rather than by anything resembling actual events. She might confess to attending gatherings that never occurred, to causing harm she had no actual connection to consorting with figures and forces that existed only within the shared cultural imagination we explored earlier tonight. Some confessions went further still, implicating other women, sometimes neighbors, sometimes family members, under the same desperate pressure to satisfy an interrogator and bring an end to unbearable circumstances. This is, perhaps, among the cruelest aspects of the entire system we've traced tonight, its capacity to turn victim against victim, suffering used not only to condemn the person enduring it, but to widen the circle of accusation further still. It bears remembering that many of the interrogators conducting these questionings believed, sincerely, that they were engaged in necessary, even merciful work, extracting confession as a path toward spiritual redemption for a soul they believed genuinely endangered. This sincerity doesn't soften what occurred. If anything, it helps explain how ordinary, otherwise reasonable people participated in a process that produced such devastating, unreliable results. Modern legal and psychological understanding recognizes clearly now what should perhaps have been evident even then. Testimony extracted under severe duress carries little genuine evidentiary value, shaped far more by the desire to end suffering than by any accurate account of events. For the women who endured this stage of the process, whatever words eventually left their mouths, spoken under conditions no person should have to bear, those words were rarely, in any meaningful sense, truly their own. Once a single accusation had run its course through a village, whether it ended in acquittal, exile, or worse, something subtle but lasting had already changed in the fabric of that community. Accusation, once demonstrated as possible, rarely stayed contained to a single case. Villages that experienced one formal witchcraft trial often saw others follow within the same years, sometimes the same season, as though the first case had unlocked a framework the rest of the community now knew how to use. Picture a village some months after its first trial. The immediate crisis has passed, life continuing much as before on its surface, fields tended, animals fed, church services attended as usual. But underneath that surface, something has shifted. Neighbors who once exchanged nothing more than casual greetings now watch each other with a different kind of attention, alert in a way they weren't before to unexplained misfortune, to unusual behavior, to anything that might, in retrospect, resemble the pattern that led to the last accusation. This heightened vigilance rarely stayed evenly distributed. Existing tensions, old boundary disputes, long-simmering resentments over inheritance or marriage, previously managed through ordinary social friction, now carried a new, more dangerous potential outlet. A grudge that might once have simply festered quietly for years could, in this changed atmosphere, find expression through formal accusation instead. Historians studying regions with particularly severe witch trial activity have noted this pattern of escalation repeatedly, initial cases followed by clusters of further accusations, sometimes implicating dozens of individuals within a single community over a span of just a few years. Once suspicion found a mechanism, a legal and theological framework capable of transforming private grievance into formal, sanctioned action, that mechanism proved difficult to close back up again. This created a particular kind of danger for everyone living within an affected community, not only those already vulnerable through isolation or poverty. Anyone who had ever offended a neighbor, however slightly, now carried some measure of risk they hadn't carried before. A dispute over a shared well. A disagreement about grazing rights. An old, unresolved insult from a wedding years past. All of it now existed within reach of an accusation that could end, quite literally, in the accused woman's death. Fear, once given an outlet this powerful, tends to seek its own continuation. Communities that had successfully identified and removed one supposed danger often found themselves, paradoxically, more anxious rather than less, scanning constantly for the next hidden threat rather than settling into any lasting sense of safety. It's a difficult pattern to sit with, this image of neighbors turning against neighbors. Women testifying against women, entire communities slowly consuming pieces of themselves in the name of protection. But it's a pattern that appears, with troubling consistency, across surviving records from this period, a reminder that fear, left unchecked, rarely resolves itself. It simply searches, again and again, for its next target. Amid all this fear and formal proceeding, it's worth pausing tonight to remember something easily lost in the broader sweep of historical record. These were real, individual women, each with a full life that extended far beyond the single, terrible episode for which history sometimes remembers them. If it remembers them at all, most accused women left behind no personal writings, no letters, no diaries. Literacy remained limited, particularly among rural women of modest means, and even those who could write rarely had occasion or resources to record their own thoughts for posterity. What survives, instead, comes almost entirely through the words of others, court records, church documents, occasional mentions in a neighbor's account book or a priest's parish notes. This means we know these women, when we know them at all, almost exclusively through the lens of their accusation, a strange and unfair kind of historical erasure. A woman who spent 40 years successfully delivering babies, easing fevers, and tending her garden might be remembered, if remembered at all, only for the single trial that marked her final years, her entire life reduced to a court record's clinical description of alleged offense. Picture, for a moment, filling in some of what those records leave out. A woman who once walked 3 miles in winter to reach a laboring mother she'd never met, because word had reached her that the local midwife had fallen ill. A woman who quietly left bread on a struggling neighbor's doorstep during a hard winter, never mentioning it, never expecting thanks. A woman who raised children not her own after their mother died in childbirth, simply because someone needed to, and she was there. None of this appears in trial records, because trial records exist to document accusation and proceeding, not to preserve the fuller shape of an ordinary life well lived. Historians attempting to reconstruct these fuller pictures must work carefully, piecing together fragments from multiple sources, parish records, tax rolls, occasional mentions in a more sympathetic neighbor's later testimony, slowly rebuilding something closer to a complete human being from what official history chose to preserve. This work matters, quietly but genuinely, because it pushes back against a particular kind of historical injustice, the way these women's entire identities were narrowed by the very process that condemned them. Down to a single accusation, a single trial, sometimes a single confession extracted under conditions no person should have endured. Tonight, in walking through this history together, we've tried to hold both truths at once. The genuine harm inflicted upon these women, and the fuller, richer lives they lived before that harm arrived, lives filled with skill, and care, and quiet daily contribution to communities that, in their worst moments, turned against them. They deserve to be remembered as more than victims. They deserve to be remembered, however incompletely the record allows, as healers, as mothers, as neighbors, as women who simply tried, in a difficult world, to live well. For those women whose trials ended in conviction, the consequences varied by region, period, and the particular severity of the local proceedings, though none of the possible outcomes offered anything resembling mercy in a form we'd recognize today. We won't dwell tonight on the specific details of punishment, which varied widely and, in their worst forms, remain genuinely difficult to sit with even in careful historical retelling. What matters more for our purposes is understanding the lasting shadow these punishments cast, not only over the individual women who suffered them, but over the communities and families left behind afterward. Picture a household in the days following a conviction. Children, if any remained, now carried a mark that would follow them for years, sometimes decades. A daughter's marriage prospects might dim considerably, families elsewhere hesitant to connect themselves, even by marriage, to a household touched by such accusation. A son might find himself excluded from certain trades or associations, the stain of his mother's conviction attaching itself to him regardless of his own conduct or character. Property, too, often complicated matters considerably. In some regions, a convicted woman's possessions, however modest, could be seized as part of the legal proceeding, leaving surviving family with even less than they'd had before. A final, practical cruelty layered atop the emotional devastation already inflicted. Communities themselves carried a different kind of lasting weight. Neighbors who had testified, whether from genuine conviction or simple fear of what refusing to testify might cost them, often continued living alongside the convicted woman's surviving relatives for years afterward, an uncomfortable, unspoken tension woven permanently into the fabric of daily village life. Some communities, in later years, quietly reconsidered particular cases, informal local memory sometimes preserving a growing unease about convictions that, examined honestly, rested on flimsy testimony and coerced confession. This reconsideration rarely took formal legal shape, at least not for centuries, but it lived on in the way certain names were spoken, or avoided, in local memory, in stories passed down through families that remembered, quietly, a grandmother or great-aunt who they believed, privately, had been wronged. It would take a very long time, centuries in most regions, before formal legal systems began seriously reconsidering these convictions, before governments and religious institutions began issuing the kind of official acknowledgement that these trials had. In the overwhelming majority of cases, condemned innocent women through deeply flawed process rather than uncovered any genuine threat. That reconsideration, however incomplete and however late, matters. It represents, in its own slow way, a community's eventual willingness to look back honestly at what fear, left unchecked, had once made ordinary people capable of doing to their own neighbors. As we near the end of our journey together tonight, it's worth stepping back from individual stories to consider what this entire period reveals about something larger, something that extends well beyond medieval villages and their particular fears. What we've traced tonight is, at its core, a story about how fear moves through a community when left without adequate outlet or examination. Unexplained illness, failed harvests, infant death, the ordinary tragedies of a world without modern medicine or science, needed somewhere to go. And in the absence of better explanation, that fear found a target in the people least equipped to resist it. This pattern, stripped of its specifically medieval details, appears again and again throughout human history, in different forms, different centuries, different targets. Communities under stress, facing circumstances they cannot adequately explain or control, repeatedly turn toward blame rather than uncertainty, toward a nameable, punishable cause rather than the harder, more uncomfortable acceptance that some suffering simply happens, without clear reason, without anyone truly responsible. Understanding this pattern doesn't excuse what happened to the women we followed tonight. Nothing excuses it. But understanding helps, perhaps, in recognizing similar patterns when they emerge in other forms, other eras, our own included. Consider what made these particular accusations possible. Genuine fear, certainly, but also isolation, the way certain women stood apart from protective networks that might otherwise have shielded them. Consider, too, the role sincere belief played, how conviction, however mistaken, often proved more dangerous than calculated cruelty, because sincere believers rarely respond to reason challenge the way cynical actors sometimes do. Consider the machinery, too, the codified texts, the legal procedures, the theological frameworks that transformed scattered village suspicion into something with institutional weight and lasting consequence. Individual fear alone rarely produces trials and formal convictions. It requires structure, permission, a system willing to lend suspicion its authority. These elements, fear, isolation, sincere but mistaken belief, and institutional structure willing to act on that belief, combined in this period to produce something genuinely tragic. Women condemned not for what they did, but for what frightened, grieving communities needed someone to have done. Tonight's story asks us to hold something difficult but important. That ordinary people, not monsters, not uniquely cruel individuals, but people much like us, frightened by circumstances beyond their understanding or control, proved capable of this. That recognition, uncomfortable as it is, matters more than simple condemnation of a distant, unfamiliar past. The women we've walked alongside tonight lived, mostly, ordinary lives. They healed, and delivered children, and tended gardens, and loved their families, exactly as women in every era have done. What made their era dangerous wasn't anything unusual about them. It was something all too recognizable about the fear surrounding them. We've walked a long way together tonight, through village lanes and candlelit kitchens, through whispered rumors and formal courtrooms, through fear that gathered slowly, like frost on a window, until it became something no ordinary life could fully escape. It's a heavy story, in places, though we've tried to move through it slowly, gently, the way this quiet hour of the night deserves. Not to frighten you before sleep, but to remember, honestly and completely, women who deserved better than what history, and their own frightened neighbors, gave them. Picture, one last time, that village we began with, mud lanes and thatched roofs, candlelight flickering behind small shuttered windows. So much time has passed since then, entire centuries settling like dust over everything we've discussed tonight. And yet, picture it once more, gently, the way it might have looked on an ordinary evening, before any of this fear had taken hold: a woman tending her garden in the last light of day, herbs growing quietly along her fence line. A midwife walking home after a birth that went well, her steps light with relief. An old woman tying dried herbs above her doorway, exactly as her mother had taught her, without a single thought toward danger. This, too, was true of these women's lives, alongside everything else we've discussed tonight. Ordinary days. Quiet competence. Small acts of care extended to neighbors who would, in some cases, later turn against them, but who, on most ordinary evenings, simply received help gratefully, and went on with their own quiet lives. Let that image rest with you as you drift toward sleep tonight, not the courtroom, not the fear, but the garden, the fence line, the fading light of an ordinary evening in a village that, for all its eventual darkness, held countless quiet moments of skill and care, and simple human kindness too. History remembers these women, when it remembers them at all, largely through their worst moments. But you, tonight, can choose to hold a fuller picture. Healers, midwives, neighbors, women who lived, mostly, exactly as anyone might hope to live, quietly, capably, tending to the people and small green things around them. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with me tonight. Let your eyes rest now. Fully, whenever they're ready. Let the village fade, gently, into whatever dreams come next, and if you found something worth sitting with in tonight's story, I'll be here again next time, with another slow walk through history's quieter corners, waiting for you, whenever you're ready to return. Sleep well.